Good afternoon and a warm welcome to all of you to Rhodes House and for the 2018 Bram Fischer Memorial Lecture. My name is Elizabeth Quiche and I am the brand new 8 weeks in warden of Rhodes House. So, very excited to be here. This is our 11th Bram Fischer Lecture. It's also on the centenary year of Nelson Mandela's birth, and so it's a very special moment. And I am delighted to welcome an outstanding speaker, Mr. Pravin Gordhan, Minister of Public Enterprises in the South African government. I will introduce the minister in due course, but before I do that, I wanted to give all of our visitors today just a bit more background on the Rhodes Trust, on Bram Fischer, and on how this lecture came about. The Rhodes Trust is a global scholarship organization, actually the oldest such global scholarship in the world, founded in 1903, which brings together and develops exceptional people from all over the world in all fields of study, encouraging them to lead and serve with courage and conviction. The selection criteria for the scholarship, and I should say we just welcomed 96 new Rhodes Scholars last Saturday to Rhodes House from all over the world. And the selection criteria for the scholarship include these powerful phrases that Rhodes Scholars should exemplify or should exhibit: truth, courage, devotion to duty, sympathy for and protection of the weak, kindliness, unselfishness, and fellowship, as well as moral force of character and instincts to lead and to take an interest in one's fellow beings. Quite important selection criteria. These qualities of character make the world a better place in both good times and bad. But it is in the darkest and most difficult times that they shine the brightest. Today's lecture honors the memory of a Rhodes Scholar who exemplified these shining qualities in truly difficult times and paid the ultimate price for doing so. But his courage ultimately made possible a brighter future for his country. Bram Fischer, who was elected a Rhodes Scholar from Orange Free State and was a member of New College in the year 1931, was a South African lawyer of Afrikaner descent who became an anti-apartheid activist, most well known for the legal defense of anti-apartheid figures. He led Nelson Mandela's defense team at the Rivonia trial, and Mandela credited him with saving him from the gallows. And you think about, if he had not succeeded in that, how the history of South Africa would have been changed. Nelson Mandela wrote, "Bram Fischer challenged his own people because he felt that what they were doing was morally wrong. As an Afrikaner, his conscience forced him to be ostracized by his own people, and he showed a level of courage and sacrifice that was immeasurable. I fought only against injustice, not against my own people," unquote. And indeed, according to Bram Fischer's biographer, and I hope you've all picked up a copy of this leaflet about Stephen Klingman's book, Bram Fischer, Afrikaner Revolutionary, according to Richard Klingman, the principal pivotal moment in Bram Fischer's life that led him to become ultimately an anti-apartheid activist of the highest order was his experience at Oxford, which engaged him with people who changed his and expanded his worldview. Following his work defending Nelson Mandela, Bram was himself arrested, sentenced to life imprisonment on the 9th of May 1966, and he remained a prisoner until his death on the 8th of May 1975 at the age of 67. Even his ashes were confiscated by the apartheid regime, and his image and his words were banned. Nelson Mandela, who was refused permission to attend the funeral, was to write subsequently, quote, "The dictators of oppression and brutality had other unintended effects, and that is what produced the Bram Fischers of our time, men of such extraordinary courage, wisdom, and generosity that their like may never be known again," unquote. We at the Rhodes Trust are deeply proud to have Bram Fischer as a part of our legacy. Last year, we unveiled a portrait of Bram Fischer. It is halfway down there. You will see that portrait of Bram Fischer, which hangs here in Milner Hall, a fitting tribute to this remarkable man. Lord Joel Jaffe commissioned the portrait, and he himself played a crucial role in the history of this annual lecture. He sadly passed away last June, and we remember him for his important contribution. We're also grateful to Dr. Ivan Malan, who is the founder of the Bram Fischer Lecture, and to Dr. Nick Cheeseman, who has chaired the organizing committee for the past several years, and both of them are with us today. Over the years, we have welcomed a wide range of speakers with a common thread of justice and Africa. One recent speaker was Catherine O'Regan, a former judge of the Constitutional Court of South Africa. From 2013 to 2014, she was a commissioner of the Khayelitsha Commission and is now, we're very proud to say, the inaugural director of the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights here at the University of Oxford. And I'm also delighted that she has recently agreed to join the trustees of the Rhodes Trust, and she is with us today. This afternoon's lecture will be delivered by another fighter for justice in South Africa, Mr. Pravin Jamnadas Gordhan. Pravin's involvement in the anti-apartheid struggle goes back to the 1970s and 1980s when he was an organizer in the student movement and a prominent leader in civic structures. He played a pivotal role in South Africa's transition from apartheid to democracy as an ANC participant in the multi-party constitutional talks, and served then as a member of parliament representing the ANC until March of 1998, when he joined and ultimately led the South African Revenue Service. During the next decade, SARS, the South African Revenue Service, developed into a formidable tax and customs administration that is recognized worldwide. In May of 2009, he was appointed Minister of Finance and had the difficult task of moving the South African economy towards fiscal stability and a new growth plan in the wake of the global financial crisis. Since then, he has also served as Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, and his current role is that of Minister of Public Enterprises. He is passionate about democracy, about racial and gender equality, and about working to build a prosperous future for all in South Africa. And we are honored to welcome him to Rhodes House today. The title of the minister's lecture is Principled Activism for Social Justice in a Troubled World. And we very much look forward to hearing his thoughts on this important and all too timely topic. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Pravin Jamnadas Gordhan, our 2018 Bram Fischer Memorial Lecturer.
Wow, that's very kind of you. Thank you, Warden, for your very kind introduction and remarks about myself, but I was just one of many, many people who contributed to what we have as a democracy today. Let me thank Professor Cheeseman and Dr. Malan for the great work that they do in continuing the memorial lecture, because I think that Bram Fischer, as I will describe in my own terms, was a fascinating and phenomenal figure in the liberation history of South Africa. So good afternoon to all the professors, to the students, and I'm sure there are many people with many other titles as well. And thank you very much for the privilege of being here. So as I said at the outset, I would like to congratulate Professor Nick Cheeseman and all those involved in keeping alive the bright and illuminating flame of the spirit of Bram Fischer. The principles he stood for, his human dignity, his selfless commitment, and his phenomenal contribution to our liberation struggle in South Africa. Thank you for affording me, a very ordinary activist of the ANC, the privilege and honor of delivering some thoughts on our current conjuncture and the lessons we can draw from Bram Fischer's life and struggles. In particular, lessons which will inspire an enhancement of social justice, a more authentic democracy through principled and progressive activism. You see, you can't take away the activist DNA in some of us, I'm afraid. I don't profess to speak with any authoritative view on these vital questions, but I do draw inspiration, as many do, from what was bequeathed to me and countless of my compatriots by Bram Fischer and others of his generation. As we once again celebrate Bram Fischer, we can use this opportunity to reflect on what progressive organizations and activists need to change in their own mindsets, outlooks, ideas, modes of organization, and forms of engagement in order to struggle with powerful but retrogressive institutions and trends that betray citizens' interests today in all parts of the world. Worse still, these institutions abuse and exploit the insecurities and uncertainties of billions of marginalized people in both developed and developing countries. In 2018, as the warden pointed out, that we celebrate the centenary of the birth of Nelson Mandela and Albertina Sisulu, both in South Africa, but in many other parts of the world, most recently the United Nations. Two inspirational leaders of our liberation movement. To Bram Fischer, who was born 110 years ago, they were contemporaries and fellow patriots. Bram was special, a rare mix of lawyer, activist, and a person of conscience who, as a white South African of Afrikaner descent, displayed a special kind of moral and political courage to challenge and struggle against the supremacy of white minority rule over a black majority during apartheid. He was a unique patriot, socialist, and freedom fighter. So it's quite interesting that you celebrate a communist in Rhodes Hall, or Rhodes House today. President Mandela hailed him, and I quote, as a courageous man who followed the most difficult course that any person could choose to follow. He challenged his own people because he felt that what they were doing was morally wrong. As an Afrikaner whose conscience forced him to reject his own heritage and be ostracized by his own people, he showed a level of courage and sacrifice that was in a class by itself, end of quote. As the warden pointed out, he studied in Oxford in the early 1930s and self-critically realized the profound inequalities between different races, the similarities between growing fascism and right-wing nationalism in Europe, and Afrikaner nationalism that was growing amongst his own community in South Africa. He believed that South Africa's future ought to be inclusive and united, with equal rights enjoyed by both blacks and whites. Your own history as Oxford University, through your association with South Africa and many inspiring South Africans, shows how human beings can progress if granted proper opportunities to empower themselves. We think of Pixley Kaseme, one of the founders of the African National Congress, who studied here in the early 1900s, was admitted to the London bar. I believe he didn't even finish his qualification as a lawyer here, and then returned to South Africa to use his legal expertise to defend the rights of black people under British rule. I am very mindful of the challenge that has been posed by South African students, both at home and here at Oxford, about the urgency of what they would call, and correctly so, the decolonization project in academia. These students have rightly exposed the limitations of much of Western scholarship for our context. They recognize the need for our academic projects to locate their focus to our country and continent if we are to solve our problems in ways that bring equality and justice to our society. Indeed, to all societies that suffer in a similar way. Similarly, Bram Fischer interrogated the world around him, its history, the relationship of power and control in particular, and how these were being played out in South Africa. He acknowledged that in order to be in harmony with his own humanity, he must recognize the plight of others in South Africa. To do so meant challenging the world of privilege and power and racist oppression and exploitation. Shortly before being sentenced to life imprisonment in his trial in 1966, Bram Fischer made a statement from the dock, and interestingly from the same dock that Nelson Mandela made his speech, one of his last public utterances, saying, and I quote, "I am on trial for my political beliefs and for the conduct to which these beliefs drove me. Whatever labels may be attached to the 15 charges brought against me, they all arise from having been a member of the Communist Party and from my activities as a member." In fact, by then he was the chairman of the Communist Party. I engaged upon these activities because I believed that in dangerous circumstances which have been created in South Africa, it was my duty to do so. End of quote. By his conduct, he provided progressives with principled leadership, both in ideas and in action. For he truly believed that the task at hand is not only to interpret the world, but to change it. His life embodied a fascinating dialectic between rejecting and opposing the oppressive and racist and exploitative system of apartheid on the one hand, while promoting the values and principles which would become the foundations of a future South Africa. He sought to transform the social and economic structure of apartheid South Africa and to reconcile all South Africans on the basis of a deep respect for human cooperation and solidarity. Propelling his actions was the idea of a non-racial, non-sexist, and united South Africa. My generation of Congress activists of the late 1960s and early 1970s developed their social conscience and political consciousness as he languished in prison and experienced the brutal inhumanity and callousness of the apartheid regime. Excuse me. It was a regime which maliciously turned on its own and refused him and his family the basic dignity and decency of spending his last days with his family without conditions. We, the activists of that generation, were the direct beneficiaries of his teachings, ideas, and activism, and his generation of leaders and activists as well. We learned the basic tools of Marxist analysis, although unlike many of you, we might not have read Marx thoroughly, I must admit. We imbibed the importance of grassroots organization and mobilization. We became alert to our responsibility to inspire hope and self-confidence in our community's ability to bring about change through active struggles around their basic needs and demands. Like senior activists of the Congress movement and of the SACP, we had the cautious belief that it was possible to create a democratic society based on social justice, very different from the apartheid system. This was to come through patient building of organizations in communities, workplaces, places of worship, and indeed universities as well. I am reminded of Ben Okri in his book, A Way of Being Free, when he wrote, and I quote, "The worst realities of our age are manufactured realities. It is our task as creative participants in the universe to redream our world. The fact of possessing imagination that everything can be redreamed. Each reality can have its alternative possibilities. Human beings are blessed with the necessity of transformation." End of quote. Colonialism and apartheid were such manufactured realities. It would take men and women of extraordinary intellectual, ethical, and moral courage to resist such a system and work for the betterment of all South Africans, irrespective of color, creed, religion, and background. Whereas it would come naturally, if you like, for a people who are denied their freedom, independence, and basic human rights, as the majority were in South Africa, to fight for a more humane society, it required formidable conviction and firm determination and courage for a person like Bram Fischer to break away from a life of privilege to work for and serve humanity. At a time when identity politics and the national question, as we call it in South Africa, is once again coming to the fore, it is useful to reflect on the role that Bram and many other patriots played in cementing the role and place of progressive whites in the Congress movement and the ANC in particular. Their role was to help the broad movement for change to develop a conception of struggle that was wider, more universal, and progressive. In 1969, with Bram already languishing in prison, the ANC issued its strategy and tactics document, which acknowledged the role and status of democratic whites in the struggle for freedom. And this document had this to say, and I quote, "We are revolutionaries, not narrow nationalists. Committed revolutionaries are our brothers, to whatever group they belong." Of course, we would say sisters as well today. "There can be no second-class participants in our movement. It is for the enemy we reserve our assertive and our justified sense of grievance." It goes on to say, "Thus our nationalism must not be confused with chauvinism or narrow nationalism of a previous epoch. It must not be confused with the classical drive of an elitist group among the oppressed people to gain ascendancy so that they replace the oppressor in the exploitation of the masses." End of quote. Bram had become the living embodiment of the future for the idea of a non-racial, non-sexist, and united South Africa, for a conception which decades later would become enshrined in our Constitution. Bram's aspiration for a future South Africa was embraced in the principles and vision of the Freedom Charter. Our Constitution and the Freedom Charter both recognize that ours was a deeply divided and unequal society while propounding an egalitarian future. These documents were unequivocal in identifying the type of national leadership, both politically and in business and in civil society, that should establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights, as the preamble of our Constitution states. Therefore, in adopting our Constitution in 1996, which law binds all of us, although today we might say some of us, or most of us, whether in politics, business, academia, the judiciary, the public service, organized labor, or civil society, we agreed that unless our behavior, our actions, and our decisions are informed by our constitutional values and by sound moral principles, we are not living up to the ethical standards we have set for ourselves, and that we would therefore be failing to provide ethical and principled leadership to our people. Bram's fight against apartheid deepened the idea that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, as the Freedom Charter says. But for Bram, this was not enough. Like former President Mandela, his was a call to us to provide principled leadership and activism to promote the core values upon which our constitutional democracy should be built: non-racialism, fundamental human rights, and social justice. Creating the conditions for inclusive economic growth and universal access and participation in meaningful economic opportunities. In our context, the quest for social justice has been a central theme for activists of both my generation and many generations thereafter. Over the last 24 years, we have been establishing and building institutions essential to support the development of our young democracy. We thrived as a young democracy in our newfound freedom, proud of our place in the community of nations and the global recognition, if you like, of our miracle. Bram Fischer would certainly have been very proud. While millions of people have moved from levels of absolute poverty moved out of absolute poverty since 1994, the obstacles we face include the performance of the economy today, and it is no secret that South Africa has excessively high levels of unemployment, poverty, deep socioeconomic inequality amongst our people. The key task of our times is to transform our economy so that it can grow with levels of inclusion and diversification. To deliver social justice as envisaged by Bram Fischer requires us to work for an inclusive economic growth. But make no mistake, South Africa and its people have made huge progress. We are not defined by corruption, as you would read about it today, and we shall not be defeated by it. We are defined by our continuous striving for a better life for all. This means bringing on board previously excluded communities into the mainstream of the economy, a task that still remains incomplete. It means reducing high levels of concentration in our key sectors of the economy and opening up new entrants, or opening up these parts of the economy for new entrants and for small and medium enterprises to play a role in the creation of our national wealth, equally a task yet to be complete. But in the womb of our progress was also growing the beginnings of a new phenomenon, a phenomenon to which many countries around the world, as Paul Collier was just telling me, are not immune. The cancer of corruption, rent-seeking, institutional manipulation, patronage, and greed. It is captured in the phrase we use in South Africa, and I'm sure you use it here at some level or the other, state capture. So how has state capture affected us? The state capture project has sought to weaken and hollow out our fledgling democratic institutions. So the very institution that you talked about earlier on, the South African Revenue Service, was also captured a few years ago. And right now we have a Judge Nugent who's conducting a commission of inquiry into what went on in this institution. And there are horror stories being told about how after 10 years of building a very proud institution and one that worked very well and contributed to the fiscal balances that we had in our own country, how it has actually declined. So a key lesson is that it can take 10 years to build an institution. It can actually take about a year to destroy it and decimate the skills that you have accumulated. State capture has done so to facilitate organized crime and for the enrichment of a few families and their friends. And I'm sure by now that even Oxford University has heard about the Guptas. Have you? Okay. You're looking very passive. We are living through a period in which there has been a deliberate weakening of the state and its ability to play a developmental role. Impunity developed amongst the looters, and with an attitude that says, I don't care what happens, as long as I serve myself and I serve my interests and I serve my networks. What kind of long-term damage has this counter-revolution actually done is a question that still remains. But there's no doubt that it has actually resulted in a weakening in state capacity, a state that we are still building, and it has appeared on the stage once we've connected the dots in a very rapid way and disclosed itself as a very encompassing phenomenon. Our criminal justice system, the courts and prosecution organs, our financial system, our public finances in the form of the National Treasury, the Revenue Collection Agency that we've just referred to, and even the Reserve Bank are targets of some of these elements operating within this state capture project. So, Ms. O'Regan, you've got to come back. There's work to do. State capture characterized by declining political morality and increasing deception, economic sabotage in state-owned enterprises, some of which I'm responsible for today, and through various other mechanisms, plundered state resources so that a few would benefit without any regard for the impact of such theft on the poor. Quasi-ideological, if you would call it that, constructs have been used to give credence to this process. Through the use of PR companies like Bell Pottinger, whose headquarters were in London, by the way, this project developed slogans like white monopoly capital to create villains amongst those brave enough to oppose them. In recent times, race-baiting slogans have emerged, such as attacks on black excellence And all of these narratives, in order to both defend the gains that people have made from capture, but also ensure that they don't end up in prison at some point in time. Social media has also been harnessed to conduct a campaign of fake news in which persons of integrity have been viciously attacked, and in an attempt to create, if you like, an alternate reality, or at least an alternative narrative. Within the state institutions, various intermediary companies and professional facilitators have created an enabling environment for looting to occur. Sadly, many of these companies are well-known multinationals and domiciled in countries like the UK, Bell Pottinger, I've mentioned, audit firms like KPMG, advisory consultants like Bain, McKinsey, and Gartner, law firms such as Hogan Lovells, and of course, some of the large global banks, wittingly or otherwise. All of these appear to have had a hand in the state capture project and are under today severe scrutiny both by South African authorities and others elsewhere. The impact of the past few years has also seen a major threat to the values embedded in our Constitution and for which people like Bram Fischer and Nelson Mandela fought. It has been replaced, in a sense, by the kind of narratives that I've just referred to. But let me assure you that all is not lost. That we do have, if you like, a new dawn in South Africa upon the ascendancy of President Ramaphosa to the presidency of the country. And today, under the banner of uniting as many South Africans as possible behind the aspirations of our country as reflected in the National Development Plan, and the attempts at renewing both the political party but also the country itself and its direction, reconstructing some of the institutions once they've been investigated so that they serve their true purposes that they were set up for. And the President has set up, as you might be familiar, with at least 2 or 3 commissions to look into, firstly, the phenomenon of state capture itself. That's the Zondo Commission that is operating at the moment. The Nugent Commission under Judge Nugent that is looking into the dynamics that unfolded in the South African Revenue Service. And there's a new commission about to be set up to look into the Public Investment Corporation that looks after almost 2 trillion rands of public servants' pension money, and to find out what was going on there as well. But what is happening in South Africa, as I pointed out earlier on, is also within the context of a troubled world, if you like. I'll just give you some headlines from a recent Ipsos survey that I saw, which shows the following features amongst the citizens and their perceptions. That firstly, systems favor the rich and powerful, not the middle class and the working class and the poor. Politicians don't care about people. People do favor outspoken politicians. They like strong leaders who break the rules, I suppose, but not for their own benefit. Regard leaders with radical ideas as a risk. Parties having been in power before are regarded as a risk as well. And you've seen in Europe some of the changes that are taking place. And authorities are not strong enough on crime, is the perception they have. Their confidence in various institutions is also shaky. There is little confidence in international institutions, in banks, in the justice system, in big companies, in governments, and in political parties. I'm sure there are many experts around here who can testify to some of this. But in addition to this, what we see are some of the following elements on the global stage as well. The decline in the influence of progressives and progressive ideas, even around basic issues of human rights. Geopolitical issues abound: South China Sea, the Koreas, the Middle East, and Eurasia, and of course, closer home to yourselves, Brexit. Global governance is in the process of being disrupted. Multilateralism is at threat. Nuclear agreements can be torn apart within a day. The WTO is at risk because of trade wars, and the G20 is reasonably ineffective compared to the kind of work it did in 2008, 2009 in response to the Great Recession. Advanced economies seem to be at odds with emerging markets, and emerging markets have been at the receiving end of a huge amount of volatility as a result of prices of oil changing and increasing, and if you like, the politics of capital flows, both into and out of emerging markets as well. There's a growing democratic deficit as a result of the unequal sharing of incomes, but also the trend towards authoritarianism that I'm sure some of you are monitoring. There's an increase in what we might call, and I use this very advisedly, cyber interference, which has opened up a new theater of potential warfare and testing of a country's sovereignty and national security defenses. As a result, there is social stress, there's identity politics, the anti-immigration politics that you see in parts of Europe, and the xenophobia that also sweeps parts of the world. Millennials have grown and have developed their own needs and trends and tendencies that half the audience here would probably find, like myself, difficulties in understanding. That's just admitting our age, that's all. There's a growing social distance between political and economic elites and other social classes, as we pointed out. The power of big tech is also being interrogated, and clearly we can see that big tech is not necessarily always good for what we have to achieve in our own world. So back to the theme in this context, both of South Africa and the world, to what we have as what I would call the new dawn in our own country. As Professor Johnson of MIT says, and I quote, "Countries rise when they put in place the right pro-growth political institutions, and they fail, often spectacularly, when those institutions ossify or fail to adapt. Powerful people always and everywhere seek to grab complete control over government, undermining broader social progress for their own greed. Keep those people in check with effective democracy, or watch your nation fail." End of quote. And I'm sure that alone would be an interesting subject for the next few hours if we had the time. In the past few months, our country and our political outlook has certainly turned decisively a new chapter. A new era has emerged in South Africa, and in President Ramaphosa's words, and I quote, "It is a new dawn that is inspired by our collective memory of Nelson Mandela and the changes that are unfolding. As we rid ourselves of all negativity, we should reaffirm our belief that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. For though we are a diverse people, we are one nation. There are 57 million people amongst us, each with different histories, languages, cultures, experiences, views, and interests. Yet we are bound together by a common destiny." End of quotation. In this period, we are acting to turn the fortunes of our country around. This requires us to address the functioning of our state system, and central to this, as I pointed out earlier, is the state-owned enterprises. And in this regard, we have to deal with both the past, present, and future of the kind of stability, if you like, within the SOEs. And for those of you that might not be familiar, state-owned enterprises were at the heart of the extraction of billions of rands of resources from the state. So just one transaction in an institution called Transnet, which is the major logistics monopoly virtually in some instances, that controls ports, an oil pipeline between the coast and Gauteng or Johannesburg, and the freight railway network. One transaction to buy 1,064 locomotives saw an original price of 38 million rands, and suddenly it just overnight increased to 54 billion rands. If I said million, it's correction, billion. And 16 billion just seems to have disappeared somewhere, including 5 billion rands that was paid as a commission to some entity controlled by one of the Gupta associates in Hong Kong. So that's just one transaction. How many more of these sorts do we have that we have to uncover and track down? Tackling the past requires that we recapture these entities and deal with a deep culture of corruption. In the present, we have to address the financial challenges such as revenue and expenditure, develop credible business plans, and deal with the duplication in many of their mandates. For the future of these entities, we have to understand the dynamics of change in their own industry, develop new business models, as the President has indicated, and address their financial sustainability. President Ramaphosa has begun an arduous task of reviving the economy by ensuring that we crowd in high levels of investment. But more importantly, there's three major projects that he has launched. And in each of these, he's attempting to build the maximum possible consensus amongst different social partners. And one of them took place yesterday, called the Job Summit. And here we had business, communities of civil society, government, and labor, all agreeing on a set of plans and proposals, but with a determination to implement these to create at least 600,000 jobs a year, 275,000 of those jobs being created by government, and others in different forms created by business and other types of ventures. And that went fairly well. And you have a foundation there for the various partners to work together as we go into the future. He announced recently a stimulus and recovery package in an attempt to, over time, get us beyond the 0.7% growth that is predicted for this fiscal year, but also above the ceiling of 2 and 3% that we've experienced over the recent past. And it has 5 key elements. Firstly, growth-enhancing economic reform. So some of you might be familiar with the uncertainties created by the capture crowd around mining in South Africa, which is still a big employer and attracts big investments into our country. And in the last week or so, the Minister of Mineral Resources, Mr. Mantashe, has announced a mining charter, having negotiated it over the last 3 or 4 months with various constituencies. And today we have a consensus document which, as one of the commentators said, most people like and some people are unhappy with, which shows that the right balance has been retained. Secondly, a reprioritization of funds within the government budget, and these reprioritized funds will be committed to job creation as well. Third, the creation of an infrastructure fund, which would result in some 400 billion rands being put together both from government resources and private sector resources, and a particular focus on education, health, and municipal infrastructure. So it's in this context that we've got to ask a few questions as I conclude. So what is indeed the role of principled and progressive activism in the 21st century? So in this context, the critical question is, what do we mean by principled and progressive activists today? And how do we define ourselves? And what mission do we assign to ourselves? Back home, the state capture era is far from over, but we're very confident that we will overcome it in due course. It has also been a period during which the focus and the connection with the soul, if you like, of different sections of society were weakened. However, people have fought back, and as they do, the strands that connect us in different communities and sectors are being joined up, and there is a regained sense of common purpose which we need to build upon. But for those of you that have an interest in South Africa, how can you inspire the same kind of activism that we saw during the anti-apartheid days in today's South Africa and in today's world? And perhaps, if I may respectfully ask you, give some thought to how do you support, if you like, the democratic project and the project of rebuilding South Africa and putting it on the right path, and indeed other African countries as well. And I'm sure there are many ways in which you could do so, both as people in this hall, but outside as well. We must also recognize that the hegemony of progressives is no more and can't be taken for granted. In other words, just being a human rights activist doesn't necessarily earn you respect automatically. There are too many other contending forces to both negate those of us who follow that trend, but also to create, as I said earlier on, different types of narratives. And they can be created by a tweet every morning, as you know. This has been challenged by new and different ideas from various quarters and new forms of organization and new forms of struggle have to be developed by certainly the younger people that are in this audience. Progressives need to become involved in a reinvigorated battle for ideas, ideas that can be translated into policy and action to improve the lives of ordinary youth, women, and citizens at large. Development and underdevelopment continue across the world. In fact, there's an ever-escalating inequality gap in most societies across the globe, and giving rise to very unintended or unanticipated consequences. There seems to be a need for us to rethink what we conceive of as progressive ideology, if there's such a concept these days, and how it is expressed in the present context. It will surely seek to combine existing elements like social justice and economic transformation, along with new contemporary elements that I'm sure you are beginning to develop and discover. So simply ensuring that young people have jobs can make a huge difference in a society. And those of us that are endowed with capital or influence over capital can certainly play a role in this regard. Ensuring that workers are paid a living wage, that those who have no wealth, as 40% of South Africans don't, begin to accumulate some wealth in this period of democracy that we have. And that we have security of tenure, either over your house or over a piece of land, which is, of course, an issue in South Africa today as well, as we begin to try to overcome our colonial legacy. How do we protect ordinary citizens from criminals a lot more effectively? And how do we overcome the perception that politicians are thieves and who only look after themselves and those that are actually close to them? I know you're going to be saying you're the politician, so you worry about that. But I think that applies to all elites, wherever you might actually find them. And so for younger people today, and for activists, or evergreen activists, which I'm sure there are many of here, many in this room, how do we get progressive organizational forms developing which can exert some kind of leverage over these situations, both in our own country as South Africa, but in many societies where these inequalities are felt, and where principled leadership like that provided by Bram Fischer are actually required. So what does that mean for the kind of alliances we build and the kind of issues that we take up as we go forward? So in conclusion, the aspirations for which Bram fought and died for were codified in many ways in the preamble of the 1996 Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, which amongst other elements says, and I quote, "We the people of South Africa recognize the injustices of our past and believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. We therefore adopt this Constitution as the supreme law of the Republic so as to heal the divisions of the past and to improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person," end of quotation. What the Constitution enjoins us to do, and you can take the spirit and, if you like, the principles of this Constitution and apply it anywhere in the world, is to unite us as South Africans of all races and work together in deepening our democracy and to extend social justice, again, to all South Africans towards the creation or enhancement of the new nationhood that we have found. This task, just like the fight against apartheid, requires leaders at all levels of society to shun all forms of chauvinism. The success of the South African experiment of creating a society wherein the former oppressor and the former oppressed live peacefully, side by side, depends on the principled leadership that was exemplified by Mandela, Tambo, Slovo, Helen Joseph, Bram Fischer, and Yusuf Dadoo, amongst many others. So I conclude with two quotations. The first by Bram Fischer himself. So as we remember and are once again inspired by the life, work, and principled character of Bram Fischer, let us recall what Madiba said. Sorry, it's Madiba's quotation. And I quote, "The names of only very few people are remembered beyond their lives. And some of those are remembered with revulsion for the harm they have done. But there are those who are remembered for the good deeds and contribution they have made to the society in which they live, end of quotation. Similarly, if you think that these hurdles that I've described and that we meet from time to time as we try to change societies and introduce the kind of values and principles that Bram Fischer and others believed in, and as you tire, think about this inspired quote from Mandela again. And I quote, "I have walked that long road to freedom. I have tried not to falter. I have made many missteps along the way, but I have discovered the secrets that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. I have taken a moment here to rest, to steal a view of the glorious vista that surrounds me, to look back on the distance that I have come. But I can only rest for a moment, for with freedom comes responsibilities, and I dare not linger, for my long walk is not yet ended." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister, for that both sobering and inspiring lecture about that long struggle that principled activists face and that the struggle for democracy continues. So thank you so much. We do have time for a few questions. So I want to go ahead and if you will, please stand and just identify yourself before posing the question. And here is your, thank you. So please.
Thank you, Minister, for your talk and also for everything that you've done, especially in the last few years in South Africa. My name is Saul Musker. I am studying a Master of Public Policy here at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. And I think that one of the things that the commissions of inquiry into SARS and state capture have brought to the fore is the crucial role that good public servants play, both in running an effective government and in upholding constitutional values. But I also know that there are many young South Africans in a similar position to me who want to enter public service and want to contribute, as you suggested, to South Africa's democratic project, but who either don't know how or are deterred by low pay in some cases, or in others by a perception that they might be stifled rather than enabled. And so my question to you, I think, is twofold. The first is, what would your advice be to young South Africans who want to enter public service today and continue the struggle of your generation? And the second is, what do you think might be done to reform South Africa's public service, to encourage people like me and my peers who are studying here to come back home and to be a part of this project? Thank you.
No, it's true. The exchange rate right now is quite discouraging. So we must confess to that. But yours is a question that many young South Africans outside of the country, and sometimes even inside the country, ask. So our first point would be develop as many of the new skills that the 21st century requires as is possible. Develop the right kind of work ethic, because it's going to take hard work, both in South Africa and on the African continent, to compete with the rest of the world and the kind of geopolitical forces that are impinging both on our own country and the continent more generally. The second is to admit that we need to do more at this point in time to attract people with skills, because people with skills are in fact the ones that were targeted for removal, dismissal, and sidelining in various institutions that were the subject of state capture. But three, we are rebuilding. And part of the constraints that we do have as a government is a 0% 7 growth and a less than efficient South African Revenue Service at this point in time, and the extremely high wage bill, which I think is about 37% or so of GDP, is a constraint on paying too high salaries. So if you might recall, President Ramaphosa introduced a term at the beginning of this year called Tumamina. I am available. So let's find, if those of you are endowed with parents that do have a reasonable bank balance, let's find a way of attracting you. And I can tell you that as we sit here, there are many South Africans, many from the white community as well, who have huge experience in the financial sector and elsewhere, who have, if you like, made their money and today are volunteering their time free of charge to sit on boards or come and give us expert technical advice and help us to overcome some of the challenges that I've actually mentioned. So on the one hand, we require patience. On the other hand, continue from your master's to your PhD and beyond if you like. But South Africa is going to need all of you pretty soon.
Thank you.
Hi, sir. Thank you for coming. And my uncle at SARS says he misses you a lot. I also have a question, is twofold, and it goes back to what you were saying about employment and the job summit. And you spoke about government expanding and private sector coming on board. But in terms of the limitations that those interventions can have, in terms of the limitations that, just inviting the public sector, the private sector to commit to employing more people, or, as you mentioned with the wage bill, the limitations of how much we can expand the public sector can bring. The first question is, what do you think structurally for the next 10 years would lead to huge reductions in unemployment for South Africa? And the second part of the question related to your position now is, are the state-owned enterprises making any strategic long-term plans to acquire more labor-intensive industries, or is there any growth in that space? Thank you. Okay, so I only arrived this morning, so your first question just slipped me a bit. Just to summarize it for me. Just about your view about looking 10 years in the future. What needs to be done? Thank you. On the employment side, let me give you a few concrete examples so that you don't think I'm talking pie in the sky stuff. Last year, or let's put it this way, post the Nenegate saga in December 2015, as you know, there was huge market turbulence in South Africa and a lot of concern about what actually happens. In early 2016, we launched what is called the CEO initiative. And together with the then Deputy President, now President Ramaphosa, the private sector developed a scheme called YES, Youth Employment Scheme, which got formalized mid-year last year or late last year, and is already beginning to become operational. And here the private sector has undertaken that 1 million young people over a 3-year period would be given either some work experience in their firms or will be assisted in starting small and micro businesses and mentored along the way, and various incentives will be given to business to get involved. A second example, there's an NGO called Harambee, which is extremely successful. It identifies young people in township areas, checks their numeracy and literacy skills, prepares them for a work environment and further training if that is required, and then assigns them to call centers, for example, or retailers. And a few thousand, if not more, every year in that kind of way have been located in the private sector, but with the kind of assistance that's required. But medium to long term, training and education need to work better than they're working currently. And secondly, there need to be structural changes in our economy. That concentration that I referred to earlier does prohibit medium and small businesses from operating. So one of the, if you like, aftershocks of apartheid that we have not been able to overcome and remains as a fault line in our country is that entrepreneurship is lower in our country than in most other African countries, for example, because those opportunities were not opened up. You don't have a parent in many households today who had some business experience or work experience to teach a younger person what it actually means to get going in this particular sector. So you have a generational gap that we have to overcome at the end of the day. on the SOEs, some of them are using labor-intensive methods, particularly in road construction. Provinces like KwaZulu-Natal have been trying it for a few years now. So a particular community structure will be given, say, 5 kilometers of road to look after, surface and resurface if need be. In that way, they make money. If they do the right quality of work, they're then given more of the road to look after. And a lot more other areas need to be found. Clearly, as Joseph Stiglitz has said recently, South Africa, and indeed most African countries, can't replicate China any longer. The low-cost production option and low-cost manufacturing, unless there are some contrary views here, I'd love to hear them, is not necessarily the sole path that is to be followed in order to become successful. What you require is a diverse strategy covering low costs, training and education, training for the digital economy and the so-called fourth industrial revolution, some elements of revival in the manufacturing sector, greater focuses on the services sector like tourism and hospitality, and a range of others. So South Africa has come up with a unique proposition around what is called the oceans economy. It has one of the largest coastlines of countries in the globe, but we don't exploit those resources that we have. So there's a fair amount of interesting work that's going on in that area as well. So it's exciting enough for young people like yourself and others to start thinking about and developing new ideas that will sustain themselves for the next 2 decades.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you, Minister Gordhan. Thank you very much. I'm Jade, also a fellow South African, doing my Masters of Law. You spoke about a new dawn and a reprioritization of budgets and funding. And I recently read about the renaming of a street to Winnie Madikizela Drive and Mandela Drive. And while I completely recognize the social and historical significance of this renaming, to me, I can't comprehend how to justify the funds when socioeconomic rights are just not a reality for so many people in South Africa. So my question, I think, is, in terms of the reprioritization of funds and budgets, what factors do you believe should be taken into account to ensure the maximum sustainable impact going forward in terms of realization of human rights? Thank you.
Well, what you're going to find in our budgeting system for many years now is that the social wage, which is largely addressed to second-generation rights, is a very significant part of our non-interest expenditure. At one stage, it was 57% of non-interest expenditure. That means housing, health, education, welfare. Our welfare system, particularly the grants, are helping a lot of people for many years now, and it's probably sitting at about 130 billion rands a year at present. So I think the issue here is not more money necessarily, but more money, but the same money or a little bit more spent more effectively with less corruption and less wastage in the system, and with a greater focus on implementation. So what you'll see under President Ramaphosa's presidency is a focus not just on generating new policies and ideas, but getting things to work more effectively and creating the institutions that will ensure that ideas are actually implemented, that we learn from experience rather than theory, although I know some of your speciality here is theory, and that experience will actually teach us how to correct and self-correct as we actually go forward. You are going to get those sorts of instances where roads are renamed in any country. There might be a place that's renamed, a corner or a statue put up. So the United Nations has put up a statue of Nelson Mandela in its foyer. But that's a way, just like that portrait that you have hanging on the wall, is a way of recognizing the contribution that historic figures have actually made in their country. And that cost is minimal compared to what is actually required in order to lift people out of poverty and make them sustainable on their own income, but more importantly, have the dignity of relying on their own income and leading their lives as they want to. So we are only 24 years old as a nation. And that's what you're inheriting as young South Africans. But that 24 years has been a formidable period with all its achievements and its downfalls as well. But you have a much better and bigger foundation for a better South Africa today than we've ever had before.
Thank you so much. Okay, one more question?
No, I don't mind. You can ask as many as you like.
Okay. True. I mean, there are so many people who want to ask a question, but let's see. Yes, right here. Yes.
Hi, my name is...
Why is it only South Africans asking questions? Bram Fischer is not of interest to anybody else.
Okay, I don't know how you knew I was South African, but hi, my name is Mbalenhle Matandela. I'm a 2017 Rhodes Scholar from Durban. And I say that because KwaZulu-Natal is very close to my heart as a principled activist. And one of my questions has to do with the Morane Commission, which is a commission that the government hasn't really been transparent about, and has been something that has been quite concerning for me being in the UK. I would just like to know, in terms of the Morane Commission, in what sense can we kind of ensure that the commission is transparent, that the people who are implicated by the commission are held accountable, and that the province is able to deal with the problem of political killings that has been, it's an age-old problem in the province. And then secondly, I have a separate question. So I think our activism as the new generation is not about peaceful coexistence. I think peaceful coexistence has been achieved. I think what we need to be thinking about critically is just coexistence. And so I would like to hear from you how you envision that happening with kind of an intergenerational kind of work around that issue, but also kind of dialogues that ensure both peace and just coexistence is maintained.
No, that's why I focus on social justice so much in my talk, because that's about just coexistence. And that is about ensuring that the inequalities in every sense of the word and across the spectrum of issues that we are confronted with in South Africa as a post-apartheid society are in fact addressed. But they are addressed on the one hand by narratives that we create so that we can motivate people, by efforts that we make to unite everybody around the goal of a just coexistence, which has happened in the past, has lost its way a little bit and needs to be recreated. And by thirdly, like Bram Fischer, engaging in concrete work, creating jobs, training people, providing your kind of education to as many young people as possible, and creating sustainable institutions that will be able to carry this forward, and changing some of the mindsets with which we work in South Africa that would actually provide the energy, the enthusiasm, and quite frankly, the kind of turbocharge that's going to be required to get things done in a different kind of way and become a competitive country and a just country at the same time. On the Morane Commission, I'm not sure if everybody is familiar, but this was a commission set up a few years ago, has just produced its report about 6 weeks ago into political killings in a province that I also come from, KwaZulu-Natal. I'm Durban born. And there were various criticisms about the commission's report insofar as it, and I haven't read it, so I can't say that that is true, that it didn't identify the individuals that might be involved in the political killings. But I hope that the province will make the report public, that once we get the prosecuting authority sorted out, and it's not sorted out yet, it's still in a quasi-captured form, if you can call it that, post Mr. Sean Abrams, then we will see a lot more assertive action taken on the prosecution side and deal with the kind of people that you're actually referring to. So let's hope that the province actually makes that report public.
Thank you so much. I'm going to now ask Dr. Nick Cheeseman, who chairs the organizing committee of the Bram Fischer Lecture, to come up and say a few words.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm always very honored that despite having left to Birmingham, you let me back in the room, so thank you very much. I can promise you, Minister, I have been mistaken for South African on many occasions, but I'm actually English, so it's okay. There are some non-South Africans in the room, but I think we've demonstrated aptly quite how much a contribution we are making to training the next generation of leaders. And I know how many of our students, for example, on the African Studies MSc do go back to make a major contribution. I really appreciated your speech today because you could have told us it was all going to be easy. You could have said, we have a new government, we've got rid of the problem people, it's all going to be all right. And that wouldn't have been the full truth. And you didn't. I think actually the word I wrote down in my notes was exactly what the warden said, sobering. And the key line that I wrote down, and I tweeted it so you can go and check later, is I think it takes 10 years to build an institution, but only one to kill it. And I've been thinking about that a lot. I don't know if some of you know, but I've recently started a column for the Mail and Guardian newspaper, and they asked me to write a column this week on what does the experience of other African countries say to South Africa about how you get yourself out of a situation like this. Because sadly, of course, South Africa has ceased to be so exceptional anymore. And the story from the rest of Africa is exactly what you said. This is not about removing individuals. This is about rebuilding institutions. Removing individuals can be done at a party conference. Rebuilding institutions takes an entire generation. And so I was really inspired in a way by the fact that you didn't sugarcoat it for us. Because I think only by correctly diagnosing the extent of the problem are we going to be able to overturn it. So thank you for an honest and insightful and a brilliant speech. Thank you also to the Warden and Rhodes House. This lecture simply couldn't exist without the support of Rhodes House. And as you said earlier, a little cheekily, it is great that Rhodes House helps us to celebrate a communist activist. Thank you also to the Rhodes House team. There is a really brilliant team here from the people on the door all the way through, in particular for us, Julie Knight, who basically organizes the lecture every year and is absolutely sensational. So we are the public face, but they are the people who actually do the hard work. And I'd like you to give them a round of applause, if that's okay. Thank you very much also to the African Studies Center, which is a sponsor and co-organizer of this lecture, and I believe we have some great African Studies students here, so good luck, it's a wonderful course. Thank you to Yvonne Milan, who does great work every year, and we wouldn't have this lecture without her. Thank you to Lord Joffrey, or as we knew him here for many years, Joel, who of course was the lifeblood and the energy, and it's good to see many of Joel's friends still here, and we hope to keep welcoming you here as a way of remembering his contribution. And one of the things that he believed, and of course Bram Fischer believed, was that it wasn't good enough just to know things and be smart. You had to do something with it. So here is the little bit of a pitch at the end of the day. It's not just a free talk. I would like to recognize, and I think maybe we should do a spontaneous round of applause, that I've just told you so it can't be spontaneous, that today the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to 2 campaigners against the use of rape in warfare. And I think that was a response to a long-running campaign to actually take things like the Nobel Peace Prize and not only look at national leaders, but also those people on the ground. So maybe a round of applause for them, but also please, as you go out, you will see on the back of your leaflets that we support through this lecture the Alliance for Lawyers at Risk, because there are many Bram Fischers working all over the world today. We don't know their stories, we will probably not remember their names, but they need to be protected and supported in the same way that he did. If you go on your phones to lawyersAtRisk.org, you can find a way of giving a small amount of money, and with that money, they will send someone from another country in the world to live with a lawyer whose life has been threatened because they are doing work defending human rights that is putting their life at risk. So join in the spirit of Lord Joffrey and in Bram Fischer. Enjoy the lecture, but also make that contribution to make sure that we honor not only their legacy, but their lives. Thank you once again for a wonderful talk, and we look forward to seeing you next year.